Hello, everybody. Welcome to Worth Knowing. My name is Dan Costa. I'm the editorial director of Worth Magazine and Techonomy. And my special guest today is Clea Kolster. Clea, thanks for coming on.
Hey, Dan, thanks for having me.
So we are going to talk about climate. We're going to talk about investing and where the two meet. You are a partner, you're a PhD, you're a partner at Lowercarbon Capital. You're also the chief science officer. I think we're in a great conversation today. We should have some opportunity for people to ask questions at the end. But maybe we start off with, I think that the title Lowercarbon Capital is pretty self-explanatory, but maybe just explain a little bit about what your approach to investing is.
Yeah, sure thing. I love the spin on my title, Chief Science Officer. Yeah, so Lowercarbon is an early stage investment fund. We back companies in all sides of the economy, from energy to heavy into chemical to agriculture, built environment. The second pillar of focus is removing CO2 from the atmosphere, recognizing that we both need to reduce emissions across all sectors, but that's not going fast enough, and we need to scale up carbon removal at a very significant pace to start getting gigatons of CO2 being sucked out of the atmosphere. The third pillar of focus is what we call buying more time for those on the front lines most impacted by climate change, first and worse. So think of it as adaptation, meet resilience. What are the kinds of tools that we need in place when the majority of the population is subject to more frequent extreme weather events? How do we ensure them? How do we start building up the tools and hardware to mitigate wildfires and prevent wildfires? As well as thinking about water access and other forms of pollutants and how that's impacting ecosystems and populations. And we're a team of operators, scientists, engineers, policy wonks, investors, and the like, doing this with a lot of passion and looking to work with really great people.
Great. Yeah, I think that it's interesting. I said the name is very descriptive, but you're really taking a much more holistic view of the climate crisis and all of its consequences, as opposed to just the carbon question. So I think that's an important thing to point out. So tell me, do a lot of venture funds and a lot of investors have science officers? It seems like it's heads of science. Like, is that a very how common is that?
Increasingly so. I think there is generally a recognition that, investing in climate tech is probably the single largest financial opportunity today, and to be able to do that well, you need informed people around the table making those decisions. And as you pointed out, I'm also a full-fledged investor. I do everything from sourcing new company opportunities to investing in them and supporting them along the way. And I think I'm excited to see more and more folks with STEM backgrounds make their way into investing, and some of them have titles like head of technology or head of science, but others are just have those backgrounds and have been investing in really great companies and can do that, taking really well-informed decisions, making sure the laws of physics and chemistry aren't being broken, while also seeing large market opportunities.
Yeah, don't break the laws of physics. That's a good standard, which is not always followed in Silicon Valley. I know that for a fact. So tell me, what does a good investment look like for Lowercarbon Capital?
Yeah, so Lowercarbon was built on the recognition that to be able to have a really significant impact on climate change, we needed to harness markets to do that. Policy and philanthropy is great, but it was just too slow. And so while there might be, say, 100 million people around the world who are willing to pay a little bit of extra money to get to buy the sustainable product or buy that EV, today, ultimately, what we know is that those 7.9 billion people can't afford that luxury, and they need solutions that are cheaper, better, faster, tastier than the incumbents to be able to make those decisions. So what a good investment looks like is a company that's bringing forward a solution that ultimately makes the incumbent process obsolete, that brings a solution that is cheaper, better, faster, stronger than what we have today. And what's super interesting is that there are a huge amount of opportunities today to do that are beneficial for the planet and reduce significant amounts of CO2 or CO2 equivalent that's thanks to huge tailwinds in technology progress, declining costs of renewable electricity, new materials, breakthroughs in electrochemistry, a whole generation of ML engineers and computing power becoming cheaper and cheaper and more accessible, and DNA sequencing and writing that has become significantly more accessible. In fact, the cost of DNA sequencing has gone down at a faster pace than Moore's law, the kind of computing power cost decline that people talk about, and that has made a lot of new solutions more accessible, like making food completely differently, or making steel and cement very differently, and that's ultimately what we look for in our investments. And the thing is that like all of these are responding to really large market sizes. Like we're not when we're doing our MOIC analysis or like assessing a new investment, we're not creating, for the most part, we're not creating new markets. Those are hundreds of billions, $trillion markets that are there. And if you can undercut whatever is existing with something that is just better and cheaper, then you can have pretty high confidence that that ends up working out really well.
So what can you give some examples of the disruptors that you've identified that you think are going to have a big impact?
Yeah, well, there's a ton, but there's a company there's a company in our portfolio called Antora, for example, that has developed a new solution to industrial heat, as well as converting electricity to for long duration energy storage. And they are today rolling out their technology to displace essentially natural gas boilers in a significant portion of heavy industry. And thanks to the IRA and the significant incentives around long duration energy storage, for example, they're also going to be able to do that to supply long duration energy storage and ultimately displace gas turbines on the grid. I mean, that's an exciting one. Another one is a company called Sublime that are making cement via a low temperature electrochemical process rather than the very high temperature kind of 1,000 degrees C basically burning operation that is currently required to make cement. And because they don't use that so much energy, because they can do that really efficiently, they can ultimately undercut current production of cement, as well as a lot of other benefits beyond just cost and emissions, which include like being able to access these solutions in a much more distributed fashion, and that are just like less reliant on supply chains that are otherwise very concentrated and fragmented today.
The cement example is really great because it's one of those things everybody takes for granted. It doesn't seem like a source of the climate problem, but it actually has lots of opportunities. And if you look at the business innovation that's required it's really just about making these businesses more efficient. And in the case you cited, It's really about lowering the temperature that's wasted heat that's being emitted, that the company is it's a cost of goods for them. So by building a more efficient system, you're also building a more sustainable system. And I see that happen in industry after industry. It's like the CEO and the CFO are totally on board with these changes because it's just building a more efficient business.
That's right. Yeah, and another example I'd love to point out is a company called Carbon Crusher that's based out of Norway, that is basically developing an enhanced way of rehabilitating roads. So I think if you're in California, you saw with the storms that just happened a few weeks ago, the road stability is a real challenge, and we need to start refurbishing them. What the carbon crushers do is that instead of using asphalt bitumen, which is a petroleum derived chemical as their binder, they have a process both to be able to use a biobinder that you can just use at low temperature, as well as a significantly better piece of hardware that essentially reduces the cost of road refurbishment by 50 to 80% and eliminates pretty much CO2 emissions entirely. You can imagine this is like a really old industry that isn't welcome to a lot of isn't welcoming to a lot of change. But when you make the economics so obvious, why wouldn't you choose to change your operations? And on top of that, you are doing something, are a better steward of the planet alongside that. And one of the tailwinds that they're also benefiting from is that petroleum prices have gone up pretty significantly. They're also very volatile. Access is pretty limited, as we know. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is impacting many aspects of our global supply chain, and that means that being able to use alternatives, and most often kind of circular alternatives, waste that you're able to repurpose, you're finding yourself with just cheaper options, and that are, again, like less constrained on global supply chains that are sometimes concentrated in very specific locations that we don't think we'll always have access to.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And there's really two crises. We never want to waste a crisis, and there's been a lot of people that have suffered from these crises. One being the pandemic, which really highlighted our supply chain fragility and the weakness of global supply chains. And then the war in Ukraine, also horrible catastrophe. At the same time, those rising oil prices have made people look at more local sources and alternative sources. And there have been some positive impacts that came from those terrible disasters.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really unfortunate, but it's kind of a crazy wake-up call. I mean, the other thing is we're obviously seeing that electrification is gonna take over the majority of our transportation sector, most likely huge chunks of heavy industry, as well as the built environment, and that means a lot of change needs to come with respect to our critical mineral supply chain. When thinking about batteries and access to lithium, it's really interesting because the majority of lithium produced today is in kind of Australia and parts of Asia, whereas actually the majority of lithium resources are in North and South America in particular. But the US actually, in theory, has enough lithium reserves to meet its future demand, but with incumbent technology, you can actually extract that economically. And one of the companies in our portfolio, called Lilac Solutions, has developed an ion exchange technology to be able to extract lithium in the brines that we have here in the US, as well as in South America, that are at really low concentrations, but represent humongous volumes. And those are challenging to access because they're mixed with a lot of other minerals. But what Lilac does with their ion exchange technology is enable basically the extraction of that at double the capacity that like the current incumbent process, which is called evaporation ponds. Literally, it means what it's called.
I didn't realize that's how lithium was extracted. That it's literally just evaporation ponds.
Yeah, it's just like creating many evaporation ponds that you let evaporate in the sun. And then so that the lithium salts get concentrated, you lose about 60% of the lithium in the process, as well as just it taking an enormous amount of time to site. Like, you can imagine just the regulatory nightmare around getting those things. Sorry about that.
No, sorry. I was wondering if it was me.
Been choppy. Oh, where did I awkwardly freeze?
I'm hoping that the feed caught a little bit more than I did, but
okay.
We were talking about lithium industry in evaporation ponds but also the larger business processes involved.
Yeah.
So there's obviously a lot of technical innovation, a lot of science that's driving your decisions. What types of investments would you not make that are maybe popular, or maybe even say they're going to work on the climate problem, but don't make it the right thing for lower carbon?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of we have made investments in software companies, and some of them do make sense in enabling really important changes. For example, around distributed energy resources, and how do you integrate and have visibility over all of the electric loads that you'll have when you have an EV and a heat pump and all of that, and how do you manage that and ultimately inform utilities so that you can start balancing that with your sources of intermittent renewable energy, that's going to be like a pretty interesting and challenging optimization problem that will require, sophisticated software. I think areas, like carbon accounting, really important, and it's going to become a huge lever for change. But like building many more carbon accounting companies, not sure if that's really going to make a world of a difference. And then I think the other area that we're a little bit more skeptical on is the role that hydrogen has to play in a future decarbonized economy. There's currently hydrogen produces, hydrogen is used in fertilizer production through the production of ammonia and in oil refineries for the most part. And that hydrogen is produced through a process called steam methane reforming that emits on the order of close to a gigaton of CO2 on an annual basis worldwide. That definitely needs to be decarbonized. I mean, especially when we're thinking of fertilizer production as well as refining, of course, and doing that through either capturing the CO2 that's produced through that steam methane reforming process, or producing hydrogen through the splitting of water via electrolysis. Great, but hydrogen in many other parts of the global economy are things that might become a little bit challenging. I mean, for a few reasons. One, hydrogen is very difficult to handle. It's the smallest molecule in the world. It's extremely leaky. And so in order to store it and move it, that's pretty expensive. You need to either pressurize it to several hundred bar, or like basically get it to cryogenic, very, very cold temps. If you're going to make hydrogen via water splitting through electrolysis, you need to start making the assumptions around like, what does that actually translate to in terms of global renewable electricity generation that's needed? And because wind and solar only produce electricity at 30 to 50% of the time, you're starting to really look at like significant overbuilding of renewable energy generation just for the purpose of producing hydrogen. Now, I think hydrogen has a role to play in some of heavy industry where it's particularly difficult to decarbonize without having a source of high temperature heat, or where hydrogen is replacing something like carbon monoxide, where you're reducing, where you're like leading a chemical reaction. But understanding the scale of energy generation that you would need just for hydrogen production alone, like not including everything else that we need huge amount of electricity generation to account for, that's going to be a pretty big challenge. And then the other thing is hydrogen. If you're considering hydrogen for transportation purposes, the production of hydrogen is about, say, 70% efficient, at best 80. And then if you're trying to regenerate that into electricity to service a vehicle, for example, that's again another 70% efficiency. That means overall you're only about 40% efficient, say, and that's a lot of losses. So anyway, the Inflation Reduction Act has like $3 per kilogram of hydrogen attributed to it, which is obviously, I mean, it's great. I'm all, the IRA has a lot of great incentives attributed to climate change solutions, but recognizing that it's not always the best thing to go forward with, I think is something that we should be talking about a little bit more, and something that lower carbon from an investment standpoint, we haven't made very many investments in kind of the hydrogen ecosystem.
Yeah, I've heard that concern about the hydrogen economy from other sources, and I mean, we have moved from a point, I think maybe 5 or 10 years ago, where it was like we needed to invest in everything because we didn't know what would work, and the problem was coming, and any forward progress was appreciated. And now I feel like we're entering a stage that's a little bit more, just a little bit more thoughtful and weighing the long-term risks and saying, like, where do we really want to double down? And solar and wind are and especially with the performance of solar and the price drops that have come in terms of the kilowatt hours there, that's probably a better place to spend our money and our time. excuse me, that there are some applications that might still make sense. So it actually goes to, you've brought up the IRA a couple of times. It's a massive bill. It's called the Inflation Reduction Act. It's really a massive spending bill and stimulus package that allocates a lot of money to a lot of very important causes. That money is starting to flow. Have you started to see its impacts on the market?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to have that amount of free money, if you will, that that can basically touch, like, I think the majority of the companies in our portfolio. That's great. I mean, from a macro standpoint, we're seeing, I think the latest count, something like on the order of $50 billion attributed, kind of spent thanks to the IRA across the board, across the US. But one of the things that's particularly interesting and exciting about the Inflation Reduction Act, beyond the total value of it, is that a lot of the provisions have now turned into being direct pay provisions. So what that means, and ultimately, I think what the IRS was looking to get out of that is to be able to actually incentivize, smaller companies that don't have huge balance sheets where they otherwise the tax credit or tax equity investors need to be involved, and that only really works if you're a very large company with a big balance sheet and a lot of taxes to offset. And so direct pay really enables companies like companies that are much smaller and startups to be able to benefit from them. So, everything from the 45Q tax credit, for example, that will pay up to $180 for carbon removal in kind of long duration storage or in permanent storage settings, as well as something like $60 per ton of CO2 utilized in industry. So that means like CO2 upcycled for chemical production or fuels or synthetic fuels. Everything around lithium-ion batteries and onshoring a lot of the critical mineral production is very exciting, and I think is having an impact in the way that a lot of our mineral production companies are thinking about where to site. What else? A lot of really great things. We haven't seen any. We know that a lot of them are going to be benefiting from them, and their margins are going to be significantly higher than they thought they were going to be. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's a pretty. I think we're getting some. We've got some questions that are coming in that we'll get to in just a second. The one thing I wanted to get to is the types of companies you're investing in. What is it that makes them different than ordinary tech startups? Is it the time horizon? Is it the regulatory environment? Is it, or is it all of those things? Like, what is it that makes those companies different from, the average tech startup?
Yeah, so I mean, climate tech is all encompassing, right? I mean, it's addressing literally every single sector of the economy. It's the way we move, the way we heat our homes, the way we eat, the way our economies fundamentally operate, right? So I think soon enough we won't be calling it climate tech anymore. It'll just be tech. I mean, other than them addressing like real market sizes that exist today, there's nothing that's particularly different in terms of how we set up our fund economics, how we select our investments, and the timelines that we foresee.
All right. So our first question, and we may have touched on this a little bit, was hydrogen consuming water is a concern for water ecosystems, like the use of water as a natural resource that's going to be used up to make the hydrogen. How big a problem is that in the hydrogen economy?
Yeah, I haven't done the math on that most recently, but I mean, right now, most electrolysis systems require pretty high purity water input. I mean, you can assume that you can take seawater and purify that pretty substantially to be able to convert that, but that will just add significant cost. So, I mean, it's both a concern from a volume standpoint, but also just from an accessibility standpoint. Where are you going to site those electrolyzers to get access to the high purity water that you would need? That just adds an additional constraint.
Yeah, and that's also one of the things that I think that was built into a lot of parts of the IRA is trying to make as much of this capacity local to the United States as possible.
Yeah.
So that this isn't, making, I mean, it's almost a retreat from sort of the global supply chain model that dominated the economy for so many years. Is that something that you would invest in companies that are sort of reshoring?
I mean, absolutely. I think many of the examples that I mentioned are ultimately getting to that, right? Like, how do you produce lithium locally? How do you produce other forms of or other critical minerals locally? And that's where waste value chains start having a real relevance. I mean, similarly, rare earths, for example, and permanent magnets that are really critical for EVs, wind turbines. Right now, the majority of that is produced in China, and being able to build up that recycling capacity locally is going to be really important in ensuring that we have that supply for like all of the electrification that we're anticipating. I mean, something like a company like Redwood Materials is extremely exciting in being able to do that for battery materials. They just got $2 billion kind of conditionally from the loan programs office. Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot more of those tailwinds. I mean, another example of that is, we work with a company that's based in the UK, but could just as well be based in the US, that is developing enzymes that can break down plastics and produce specialty and commodity chemicals at specialty chemical margins, and being able to both use that local waste as well as onshore a lot of that capacity is really exciting. I mean, one thing is onshoring, but then the other thing is like something like there's a chemical called ethylene that I don't know if the audience has necessarily heard of, but it actually turns out to be like the most important or one of the most important commodity chemicals for all of our consumer goods. I mean, honestly, like anything you name it, ethylene has been part of that process. And currently the majority of the production of ethylene is in the Gulf of Mexico and in the Houston area. And every single time there's a freeze or a hurricane or something from an extreme weather standpoint that happens there, that supply starts getting constrained, and you have many ripple effects across the economy. And so just being less reliant on concentrated single sources of inputs is a huge trend within any of the companies that we invest in and across climate tech, which I find really exciting.
I want to give people a few more minutes to ask you questions. But so in terms of ethylene, I don't think I've ever heard of it before, but my sense is that it's used in plastics processing. Is that accurate?
Also, yeah.
So we definitely need to get some more sources of ethylene because those hurricanes keep hitting Houston with some regularity.
They sure do.
Clea, this is great. We actually got in touch because we wanted you to speak at our climate conference, which is happening March 28th in Mountain View, California. Techonomy Climate. You can find out all about it on Techonomy Climate. But you weren't able to make it, so we were able to do this phone call. And I thank you so much for making the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to chat.
We have a question from a reader. How old is the fund and how large is the firm? So maybe they joined us later before you got to that part.
Yeah. So Lowercarbon Capital was founded in 2018 by Chris and Crystal Saka, who joined forces with Clay Dumas. We had been operating as a family fund for several years, and then in 2021 took external capital for the first time. We now have about 2 billion in AUM, and have a mighty team of 16 and growing.
Great. Well, Clea, thanks so much. You want to tell people how they can follow you and keep up with the investments that you're making?
Yeah, sure thing. I mean, feel free to follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Lowercarbon Capital. It's pretty obvious. Lower carbon, one word. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn and Twitter, Clea Kolster.
Very cool. Well, Clea, it's been great talking to you, and I'm sure if we can't get you to the economy climate West Coast, we're going to be doing it again on the East Coast in September. So I'm sure we're going to be in touch.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. Take care, Clea.
Bye, all.
All right, bye everybody. We'll be back with more of these interviews in the coming weeks. So follow us on socials.